It seems like you guys liked the last video on everything you need to know to read Nietzsche, so now we're going to do the same here for Kierkegaard. Now, very similar to Nietzsche, you need to start with the Greeks. Now, it's very important to understand that Kierkegaard was a great admirer of Socrates. And since Plato wrote for Socrates, I would obviously start there. Now, I would recommend reading as much as you possibly can by Plato. I think that's just good general knowledge for philosophy. But if you're going to do the bare minimum for Kierkegaard, I would recommend these two. Apology is really important because you need to understand sort of the core of Kierkegaard's existential argument. And a big part of that is grasping that model of Socratic subjectivity. And then Euthyphro is very important because it really gets to the bottom of that faith versus morality argument that is sort of the center of Fear and Trembling, which is, of course, one of Kierkegaard's most famous and important works. On the topic of Socrates, I would also definitely recommend Kierkegaard's Dissertation, which gives a more in-depth dive to his perspective on Socrates. After that, I'd read Aristotle, particularly this. This is important if you really want to get into Kierkegaardian ethics, particularly his argument for faith sometimes needing action that transcends ethical reason. After this, I would definitely try and read Kant, particularly this book. Understanding Kantian ethics and the categorical imperative is important for, again, understanding Kierkegaard's argument of faith sometimes moving beyond a universal principle or reason. And he does this through the usage of the story of Abraham. While you don't necessarily need it, I would also recommend then reading the book of Abraham, particularly in the Old Testament, Genesis. I want to say Genesis 22. Now next, and perhaps most importantly, is Hegel, particularly this book. If you only read one book, I think this would probably be the most important. A lot of Kierkegaard's writing is sort of disassembling this idea that Hegel had. Hegel wanted to construct this complete philosophical system explaining consciousness, reality, and much of Kierkegaard's writing is simply an attack on this. Now, when it comes to actually reading Kierkegaard, I would do it in this order. First, I would actually start with C. Stephen Evans' Introduction to Kierkegaard. I actually can't recommend this enough. I usually don't recommend these kind of things, but this book is just a perfect comprehensive introduction to his major works. Now, when you're actually moving into his works, I would start with Fear and Trembling. I think it is probably the most accessible. It's not very long and it's deep, but requires the least amount of background knowledge. After this, I would move on to Either Or. This is where you really get into the bread and butter of Kierkegaard. This is where it becomes a lot more comprehensive. And this is where you really see the vast majority of his existential ideas appear. Lastly, I would move on to Sickness Unto Death. This is definitely the most abstract and complex of his works, so I would definitely recommend reading this one last. This book is very psychological and can often read like theology mixed with existential psychology, but nonetheless very important. So that's how I would recommend reading Kierkegaard. If you want to keep going further, I would then go on to Nietzsche, as I expressed in my previous video, and this is where Nietzsche really starts to go and just kind of attack everything that Kierkegaard did. But nonetheless, as far as Kierkegaard goes, this is everything you need to know to really grasp it.